Hello. Welcome to the .NET Community Stand-Up. Yes, .NET Data Community Stand-Up. Sorry. I was all preparing for that and then I got it wrong anyway. This is what was previously known as the Entity Framework Community Stand-Up, but we're rebranding for this year based on the fact that we talk about a lot more stuff than just Entity Framework, including OData and GraphQL and system data stuff and things like that. So I'm here with members of the .NET Data team at Microsoft. Maybe we should go around. Mac is in the background, messing with my stuff.
Mac is a cat.
Alice, yes, Mac is a cat. Alice is upstairs sleeping. She may be here later. So let's go around and just have everybody introduce themselves since this is a new year. So my name's Arthur, and I'm the engineering manager for .NET Data and Entity Framework at Microsoft. And we also have Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy, and I'm the program manager for .NET Data and Entity Framework.
And we have Bryce.
Howdy, I'm Bryce Lamson. I'm like SQLite and migrations.
And Shai.
Hi, I'm Shai Rojansky. I do a lot of Postgres stuff. I do a lot of perf stuff and system data and Linux stuff, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so having said that we do a lot more stuff than Entity Framework, today we're going to talk about Entity Framework. And specifically, we're going to talk about EF Core 7, which we're also referring to as EF7, which is likely to cause some confusion, but people will get over it in 10 years or so. And that's the way it is now anyway. We're not going back on it. So it's EF7, but it's the next version of EF Core, so EF Core 7.0. Before we get onto that, let's do a quick state of the unicorn. Okay, so let me find my mouse pointer here. Okay, so if you have been hibernating since last year, which I know a lot of people have, EF Core 6.01 is on NuGet. There's 500,000 downloads already of that, so go get it. There's more than 1 million. We're closing on 2 million if you count up all the 6.0 EF Core 6.0 NuGet downloads so far. If you haven't seen it already, there's What's New. There's a link there for What's New. You can find it on a doc page for everything that's in EF Core 6.0, and we're working on additional bug fixes that will ship in the 6.02 patch in February. Also, Jeremy has been working hard on a blog post and docs for porting from EF6 to EF Core. So this shows you how to port from EDMX code first, database first. It has detailed cases where things are different. We also want your feedback. If you do this, then let us know what you run into so we can make this better and add cases that we've missed. I put up here a little graph of this is from NuGetTrends.com. It's a great little tool for looking at the downloads of NuGet packages. The orange line is EF Core. The blue line is the old Entity Framework package, and this is about 4 years of data. So if you're still on the old Entity Framework, you can see you're kind of behind the curve. Yeah, it's been almost 2 years now since NuGet downloads of EF Core have been more than Entity Framework. So we'll talk a bit more about going from EF6 to EF Core later on today. But yeah, the porting guide should help you. It's probably a pretty good time to start thinking about that. There's caveats, but read the doc and you'll find out. And then finally, EF Core 7, we have the plan out, and that's what we're going to talk about. So let me switch over to that. If I can find, I get very confused about where my mouse pointer is. Here we go. So actually, I meant to start back here. Let me go back. So this is github.com.net EF Core, starting page for all GitHub stuff. So one of the ways that you can get to it is if you click on issues, then we have this link planned for Entity Framework Core 7 here. Now, what this is a brief summary of the actual document, but also, and I wanted to call out, this is a place where you can comment and you can discuss with the team what's in the plan, what's not in the plan, get clarification and so on. You see there's a bunch of discussion going on there already. And then the actual link to the plan, which is in our docs page, is here. So this is in the Entity Framework docs. There's a link right at the top level here after the what's new in EF Core 6.0, breaking changes, and then the plan for Entity Framework Core 7. So basically, I'm just going to go through this, call out, type in, well, don't call out because we won't hear you. Type in your questions, and Shai and others will be monitoring those, and we'll try and answer your questions. As I've said, this is Entity Framework Core 7. We're referring it to as EF7 because it's a lot easier. It's not the next version of EF6. There is no next version of EF6. Interestingly, when EF Core was first being written, it was going to be called EF7. So if you look back long enough, you'll find references to EF7 from a long time ago. But we have now actually caught up, and we're really at EF7. Release. We have a standard release cadence now, released the same as .NET does. So this is going to be released in November 2022, same time as .NET 7. We're not planning for there to be any 6.1 release. There's no reason for that other than the cadence of .NET releases has settled to about yearly, which seems to work quite well in terms of baking things in, but giving a reasonable, updates at reasonable times. As again, the same as with .NET 7, this will not be a long-term support in LTS release. EF Core 6.0 is long-term support. EF7 will not be long-term support. So it will have basically a year of support and then 6 months of crossover time once EF8 goes out. There may be some breaking changes, but we hope to keep those as minimal as possible. Each release, we have fewer breaking changes. It's important not to never make breaking changes, or we get just in a stagnant place, kind of like the full .NET framework has got to. But at the same time, we recognize that updating is very important, and we want to keep it as easy as possible. Okay, so on to the more interesting stuff. We've basically broken down this plan into 4 themes, and while this kind of relates back to the .NET data versus entity framework thing, while this is the EF7 plan, it's really the plan for the .NET data team, so the entity framework team. So it actually includes some stuff on here that isn't really EF7. So in the theme, we've got there's a big section of highly requested features. If you vote thumbs up for features on GitHub, we look at that in our planning, and a lot of those have made it into the plan this time. So your votes really count. If there's things that aren't on here that you want, make sure you go vote for them so that they move up that list. It's not the only thing that plays into the planning. There's a lot of other things. We have a doc page that tells you, there's a link here to the planning, tells you how we do it. But the votes are important. So that's one of the themes. Another theme is basically moving the .NET platform and ecosystem forward. So this is both EF stuff and non-EF stuff that help bring everything together and make .NET good to work with data across different areas, different app models, different platforms. I'm going to talk a little bit more about moving from EF6 to EF Core. EF Core 6.0 has pretty much what the most significant things that people use from EF6 in it. But there's still a few things missing. There's actually a lot of overlap with the highly requested features, but we want to make sure that there's a clear path forward. And that's kind of part of what the porting guide that we talked about earlier is for, making sure that people can move from EF6 to EF Core. And then, as always, we work on performance. Performance is a very important theme for both .NET in general and for .NET Data and EF. And again, some of the performance stuff here won't be directly related to EF, and some of it is. You can track progress on our bi-weekly updates, which you can find as another pinned issue on the GitHub repo. There'll be the first one for 2022 will be out tomorrow, assuming I get it written. And with that, let's go into the features. Any questions before we start, Shai?
Not questions,
Nope.
Just happy
Okay.
we're getting to the features.
Okay. JSON columns. So, so this was something that we really hoped to do in the last release. Pandemic and other things got in the way. but it's a high priority. This release, Maurici's going to be working on this pretty soon now. The idea here is that you have JSON columns in your relational database, and you're able to query into those columns and do various things with those columns. So it's kind of like a hybrid approach where you've got a relational database, but where you need a document inside that, you can get the advantages of having a document there. This is something that's already supported by the Postgres and MySQL providers. And what we're doing here is we're bringing it to SQLite and SQL Server, which includes Azure SQL, and hopefully in a way that creates a fairly uniform, consistent experience across those different providers as much as possible. As always, we don't aim to make everything exactly the same, because that dilutes the advantages of certain databases over others, and can make things not optimal for certain databases. But as much as possible, we want there to be a kind of consistent experience there. So yeah, bringing that to SQL Server and SQLite. I think this is our top voted issue at the moment.
I'll just say that this saying JSON support is obviously very abstract and somewhat vague. There's a lot of work into understanding exactly what this would mean and what would be delivered, and we won't necessarily, so we may deliver some things in EF7 and then add other things in EF8, because it's really a huge domain, like what kind of support you're going to get. So also let us know what specifically you're looking into on the issue and so on. We will be doing a serious design discussion and investigation, obviously, across databases.
Very good point. And I do want to point out, you can already map your JSON columns to strings. That's perfectly fine. So if you've been waiting for that, wait no longer. That already works. This is actually about understanding that they are not just strings, they are JSON, and doing JSON-y things with them.
Exactly.
Okay, next one, bulk updates. So what do we mean by this? Bulk updates is perhaps a bit ambiguous in many respects. Firstly, I should say this is not batch updates. So this is not calling save changes and batching everything. That's been baked into EF Core since the very first release. That was not something that EF6 supported, but EF Core has always supported that. This is, in fact, and I like the term set-based updates, because effectively what you're doing here is writing a predicate. So you're saying, I want you to delete all of the things, all of the orders where the expired date is before this certain date type, right? So you're basically, rather than loading everything into the change tracker and then finding out, rather than running a query that says load into the change tracker everything which is every product which is expired, and then mark them all as deleted and then call save changes. Instead, you're just sending a command directly to the database to say delete all of these things that meet this predicate. That has disadvantages as well. If you're showing a graphical user interface with data binding, for example, then you're not going to get that updated. So your tracking information is not going to stay in sync. But on the other hand, it's a lot faster. It's a lot more performant when you do need to just do these kind of bulk operations. Also, when it says updates here, it really means, as I've just pointed out, deletes as well. So you'll be able to update or delete, but you give this API. Doing bulk inserts is a little bit different. There's been a lot of discussion around that. It's not explicitly included in here. It has different requirements. Obviously, they don't exist in the database. So you can't just send a predicate to the database and say, insert what? But again, it's kind of related. So check out the discussion on the GitHub issue. Each of these things are linked to the GitHub issue. There's a lot of discussion on there. Excuse me. So yeah, I think this is something that we've been wanting to do for quite a long time, and is highly requested. I think it'll make a big difference to perf and usability. Excuse me, sorry. So bulk updates. Any comments on? I think Shai, you're assigned to do this, right? You have any comments on this?
I did a lot of the design, but I think Smith is the one actually who is going to implement this.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we still, if you look at the issue, you still see the C in CUD, so create, update, delete, whereas we should maybe update. So we haven't really discussed this up to the very end. We probably will not be delivering any sort of insert or create bulk functionality in 7. It's also important to distinguish what we mean by that, so our viewers understand. So one idea of bulk insert is really bulk insert, so sending a lot of data from the client to the server. EF Core already does that to a certain extent. So when you're inserting a lot of rows, EF Core already batches that thing. So it does it in a single round trip, which is relatively efficient. There are other options, lower level, very database specific mechanisms for pushing, ingesting a huge amounts of data, but these are not something we would likely abstract over in EF Core, definitely not in EF7. Another way to understand this by bulk insert is to understand taking rows from one table that's already in the database and moving them or copying them across to another table based on a predicate. So there you actually can use a predicate, and in that sense, it does qualify as sort of a set update kind of operation. But you're moving data inside the database from one place to another. I personally also don't think we're going to get around to this in EF7, but who knows? And we'll probably split it off and then see how many people actually want the this moving capability kind of thing. But other than this, the update and delete, I'm extremely happy we're finally getting around to this. This has been one of my personal things which I've wanted EF to support, and I'm very happy that it's finally in the plan.
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate like how impactful this is, like today the ASP.NET MVC templates, it scaffolds a create, update, and a delete. And like Arthur was saying, that delete queries all the data back just to then delete it from its ID. So this really does avoid a lot of round trips to the database.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. The next one is lifecycle hooks. So what do we mean by that? I think this is a term that Diego came up with years ago, and we still use it. It basically means events, interceptors, callbacks, hooks, whatever term you want to use. Getting your hands on what's going on, so you know what EF is doing internally, so you can impact it. This is something that we've done a lot of. We already have a lot of this stuff in EF Core that's gone in over the various releases. So the issue here is to flesh it out, make sure we've got the important events in there, we've got the important hooks. The obvious one is object materialize that I've been holding off doing for what I hope are good architectural reasons for quite a long time, but I think we're ready to do that now. But again, this is something, go to the issue, and if you have a particular need for a particular event, then let us know. I'm not saying it will necessarily get in, because the list of things that we could have hooks for is huge, and it's not necessarily best to have them all, because there's cost, potentially perf, as well as development time and maintenance time of adding each of these. Also, whether we do interceptors, events, or other things, or both for various of these things is still remains to be determined. But if you have things that you need, then definitely go comment on this issue and let us know what kind of hooks you need. Any questions I should stop for, or should we keep going? Let's keep going.
I think we're okay.
Okay, so table per concrete type mapping, or TPC. So EF Core has always supported TPH. We almost released 1.0 without TPH, but we didn't. We put it in there. So TPH is where all of this. So let me step back a little bit further. So if you have an inheritance hierarchy in your domain model, in your C# classes, so you have a animal, and then derived from animal there's a dog, and there's also a cat, and then rabbit, and then there might be an equine beast derived from animal, and derived from that there's horse and pony and various other things like that. That doesn't map directly to relational databases. Now Postgres has some funky support to directly do it, but we won't get into that now, because that's a fairly niche thing that is not necessarily recommended anyway. But generally, your relational data model doesn't support that kind of thing. So you have to decide, okay, how am I going to translate that C# domain model into something that the database understands? And there are three main mapping strategies for this, and they're known as table per hierarchy, TPH, table per type, TPT, and table per concrete type, TPC. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. Table per hierarchy is basically where you have one table for the entire hierarchy. So all of your cats, dogs, ponies, horses, everything will all be stored basically in the animal table. Now, if there's a column horseshoes, for example, that only applies to horses and not to cats and dogs, then for cats and dogs, for rows that are cats and dogs in that table, they just won't have any data in there. So this creates generally quite wide tables, which are sometimes, depending on the hierarchy, maybe sparsely populated, but generally actually works very well, and it's very efficient, especially with modern databases and the way they work. So this is why it's kind of the default and why we implemented it first. Usually if there's no good reason to do otherwise, I would say just go with TPH. People get concerned about very wide tables, and that can be a concern if you've got like hundreds of classes with hundreds of properties, but generally it's for most applications it's not an issue. And the other most common type is the next most common type is TPT mapping, table per type. And this is where you have one type for animal that contains the common properties, and then you have another table for each of the subtypes. So you'd have a table for cat and a table for dog. If you had equine beasts, horses, and ponies, then you would have a table for equine beast and a table for horse and a table for pony. Okay, so if I want to now query, so what this means is that you don't have any, columns in tables that are not used in the type for that particular type in your domain model. So, but it also means that if I want to get all the data for a horse, I have to query from the horse table and join that with the equine beast table and join that with the animal table in order to get all the properties I need. If you're querying for everything in the hierarchy, you have to join across lots of tables to get all of that stuff, which can be quite inefficient. So this is a very kind of normalized thing. So it's often DBAs will often say you've got to do TPT because it's quite normalized. But from a performance perspective, it can be quite a pit of failure in performance if you're querying a lot across the hierarchy.
On the insert case too, like you have to insert into 3 tables just to insert
Absolutely.
a single record.
That's
Yeah, good point, Bryce. Yeah, so TPT is supported in EF Core. Did we do it in 5 or 6? I can't remember. Anyway, in EF Core 6, it's definitely supported. It might be in 5 as well. Can't remember. Because people want to use it, but personally, I don't think if I were starting, I would use TPT, which then brings us to TPC. So TPC is kind of a extension of TPT, except that every type in your hierarchy gets its own type, every concrete type. So in this case, if animal is an abstract type, because nothing is just an animal, it's always a cat or a dog or a horse or something, then there would be no animal table. But you would have a table for cat, a table for dog, a table for horse, and a table for pony. And each of those would have basically would have columns for all of the properties. Even if they come from the animal class or from the equine beast class, they would be included in the table for the concrete type, so the type that you're actually querying from the database. So what this means is that you now you have it's somewhat denormalized, right? Because you've got multiple columns that are representing the same things in the domain model. But when you're, for example, inserting a horse, you only need to insert a row into the horse table. You don't need to insert, as Bryce was saying, into multiple tables. When you're querying for horses, you just need to query from the horse table. You don't need to join across a lot of those things. So TPC is very useful in places where TPH is perhaps not the best strategy because you've got very wide data, you've got many subtypes, but you want multiple tables, but you don't want that performance overhead, that cost basically of then having to join across everything whenever you query the data. So when Andrew was working on TPT, it's all been he set up all of the kind of architecture and everything to also do TPC, and so now we're actually putting in the API surface and the bits required to do that in EF7, and because of that, infrastructure also means general entity splitting. So generally taking entities and splitting them across multiple tables, that will also be supported in EF7. Anybody have any more comments on that?
I'm really excited about entity splitting. One of the reasons on SQLite, when you do full text search, you kind of have to put that in a separate table. And so you have two tables that represent the same entity. But today, because we don't support entity splitting, you can't really map that the ideal way. And you have to do like a join or a navigation property between the two. So I've been waiting for that one for a while.
Absolutely, yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
I find this, a few words, I find this always an interesting thing because, as Arthur said, a lot of users come with a very normalized kind of tendency. They know how they're supposed to represent things, they've been told, and they split everything into a lot of tables, and everything has to be perfectly normalized, and there's not enough appreciation to costs of having a fully, completely 100% normalized kind of thing. Joins are a huge source of performance problems as your hierarchy scales, as you have more and more things, you're joining more table. It's potentially a huge source of potential problems. Whereas if you just do TPH or TPC, sure, you're going to have a lot of empty columns, but typically that's not as much a problem as people would think. So people come with these kind of preconceived notions about how databases work performance-wise, and that doesn't always correspond to reality. So I'm very happy that we're bringing this in, because it's like this exact middle way between TPT and TPH, which is efficient and at the same time normalized enough and preventing those a lot of those duplicate things. So that's
Absolutely.
a good thing.
Yes. So, okay. What do we say about this? When I started on .NET Data Entity Framework, which was almost 14 years ago now. Wow. Having stored procedures that did everything in your database was pretty common, and we had people coming saying you've got to be able to. The DBA won't let me delete directly from a table. They won't let me insert directly into a table. They won't let me update a row in a table. I have to call a stored procedure to do that. We see lots less of that now. I think that kind of DBA approach is not nearly as in favor as it was back in the day. However, they're still out there. There's applications out there. There's databases out there that are still locked down, and the only way you can create, update, delete CUD operations is by calling stored procedures. And so this brings that requested feature to EF Core, where so basically the way this works is you do the same thing that you would normally do with the change tracker. So you query an entity, you change some properties, and then you save it. We detect what properties are changed, but instead of just doing a update call to the table, we'd actually call a stored procedure with the new values, and the stored procedure will be the thing responsible for doing the update. So yeah, definitely kind of a legacy pattern support, but if you're working with a database that works like that, then something that's needed to do that. I don't think there's much more to say on that. Could have sparked a heated debate if there's any DBAs listening, but we'll see. Value objects. So again, this was something that we wanted to support in EF Core 6.0. I'm a manager, and I'm still not 100% used to being a manager. So I said to myself, yeah, I can implement this. And then I had manager stuff to do, and so I couldn't. And so we never got to it. So this year, we've assigned it to Andrew, who is much more proficient at getting loads and loads of stuff done. And so I'm really hopeful that we'll get it in here now. There's a lot of history around this. In terms of we implemented aggregate support with which uses own types, and there was a desire that those could also work like value objects, because if you squint, they kind of look similar and they kind of have similar behaviors. But there's one key difference between aggregates and value objects. Aggregates are entity types, and they have keys, generally speaking. And certainly in the EF implementation of them, they have keys. You may not see the key because it's mapped as a shadow property. And so it might look like this thing is not identified by its key, but it really is identified by its key. Value object, on the other hand, explicitly does not have a key value. You can't address a value object by its key value. And that's kind of a DDD concept, but it's a more general concept than just DDD. It's just, kind of a similar way that you might create a money type, for example, in your domain model, which just represents a currency and a value, a monetary value. There's no key for that thing. You don't give £7.50 an ID of 1 and £7.65 an ID of 2, right? They just exist. They have their own identity based on the fact that it's £7.50 and pounds, right? And likewise, $7.50 in dollars would be a different value, but again, you don't give it a key. So that's basically what a value object is. So we want to add basically first-class support to this. It's very similar in many respects to complex types in the old EF6 stack. I'm not going to get into how it's different. But essentially, if you were using complex types and then you try to use own types, you may have run into issues due to the fact that they behave differently because they actually own types actually have keys. Value objects makes that better. They're also a very natural fit for C# structs, value types, because again, you don't really need to reference these things by an instance. There's no concept of, this one being the same or different from another object based on the fact that it's the same interest. They're just the same or different based on whether they have the same values. So we hope by adding better support for this, we'll make it easier for people to do the DDD stuff, but also anybody just writing normal domain models, they'll be able to map things like a money type a lot more easily like this. So that's value objects. Call out if we should stop, otherwise I will move on. Okay, value generation using value converters. This is actually somewhat related to value objects. There's a pattern that some people like. I'm personally not a fan of it, where you want to create strongly typed IDs. So, for example, you've got products and categories. They both have integer IDs in the database, but you want to give product a C# type product ID and category a C# type category ID, and all this thing does is wrap an integer, but it has kind of a protection, if you like, a type safeness. It's very Ada-like in a sense, in that it lets you say, okay, a product ID can only be assigned to a product ID, and a category ID can only be assigned to a category ID, and you can't accidentally set a product ID to a category ID. So when you do these kinds of things, you can do this already in EF Core, and it works pretty well. You just need a value converter on them. However, there's limitations in how we then do generated values, because if you've got an integer in the database, but it's not an integer in the domain model, then it becomes a little complex how you reason about when the value should be generated, how to propagate that, and such like. We support some of this already in EF Core 6. This item is, in a similar way to the Lifecycle hooks item, is about wrapping that up and making sure that this is supported more generally. And I've used integers as a example, but this also would work for GUIDs or strings or other types of values that you might have generators for. Okay, raw SQL queries for unmapped types. So this is something that I've probably said this before. I'm going to say it again anyway. Rowan Miller, when he was PM, said we can't ship EF Core 1.0 without this feature. And we've ended up now on, actually, he said we can't ship EF7 without this feature. So now we've got to EF7, we're going to ship this feature. I'm being somewhat facetious. What we actually did was implement From SQL, which is a very powerful and useful raw SQL API that lets you compose LINQ on top of raw SQL. So you can write a base query and then put a where clause on top of LINQ. That's something that EF6 never supported, and I think that's really powerful feature that allows you to mix both a base raw SQL query with the power of LINQ on it. And so we shipped that in 1.0, but the downside of that was it required types to be mapped in the model to work. So if you wanted to return a product from a raw SQL query, that was fine because product was mapped. If you wanted to return some arbitrary type that was projected out of some arbitrary raw SQL query that joined multiple tables together, that wasn't supported. So in EF Core, in EF7, we are adding support for basically being able to do a raw SQL query that returns just some arbitrary type, and the properties in that type would just be mapped by convention in a similar way to the methods on EF6 allowed you to do this. Included in this item is raw SQL queries that just return a simple scalar type. Scalar is a ambiguous term, but simple type like GUID, date, time, int, string, decimal, whatever. You can write a query easily that will just return one of these things. Shai, do you want to say how you can do all this stuff already? But
exactly, that's exactly what I want to say. I actually objected to this. I kind of fought against this feature. I just a couple words on this. So I just want to make sure that people are aware. It's very easy to do this today. There's a very well-known .NET thing called Dapper, which allows you to send a SQL and it maps the results back to whatever you want to map them to any type that you want. So this is basically about implementing the thing that Dapper already does, or part of it, to be precise, in EF Core, so that you wouldn't have to use an additional thing outside of EF Core, which I guess is reasonable. I can see people getting excited about this. So, I mean, we're doing it, but it's important to understand this is not like something that you should be blocked on. You should not be saying, I cannot do this right now, so I can't use .NET or something like that, right? All you need to do is to not expect a single tool to take care of all your data needs, which I think is reasonable, but I lost this fight, so we don't always agree inside the team.
Even if you don't want to use Dapper, actually Eric EJ has a pattern that he shows that allows you to do this fairly easily, just in EF without Dapper. So there's workarounds, but this makes it so you're not, you don't have to bring in another project reference or have kind of a third party like pattern around something. You can just do it first class, which I think, as Shai
Dapper
said,
is
make
first
people
class.
Happy.
It's just not Microsoft.
Yeah, but you're not required to have. I mean, we love Dapper, right? But we don't necessarily want to say, oh, if you want to do this, then you have to bring in Dapper to do it, right? It's like, if you don't, I know we're not going to agree, Shai.
Yeah. We're not going to agree.
but it's in the plan now. So
it's important to show that there's discord in the team and so on. And we don't agree over everything. That's fine.
Another point on that is that EF6 supported these patterns, and so this is also about porting, helping people port.
Absolutely, which we're going to get to more later. But that's a very good point, Bryce. Okay, so this is one that's very dear to Bryce's heart. So basically, here the idea here is when you reverse engineer a database, or you scaffold a context and types from the command line. Right now, the code we generate is pretty much hard coded into there. There's third-party stuff. There's a handlebars template out there that does it. Eric EJ's Power Tool does it as well, using the handlebars thing. But what we want to do in EF7 is actually have first-class support for T4 templates, again, similar to what was there for EF6, so that all of the requests interestingly, this issue itself isn't highly requested. What's been highly requested here is all of the different ways you want us to generate entities when you reverse engineer. And now I'm not just talking about curly braces, but I'm talking about, is it an auto property? Is it virtual? Is it not virtual? Does it automatically initialize its navigation properly? And there's so many variations of things that you can do. And this basically will allow you to customize those templates, customize that process with templates. Bryce?
Yeah, I mean, if you're familiar with EF6, you probably ran into T4 before. That's one of our reasons for choosing that. The handlebars is really good, but it's primarily about token replacement. And so if you want to put a bunch of logic in your templates I guess it supports if and for each, but beyond that, you have to do a lot of massaging of the data before it gets to the template. One nice thing about T4 is it's just C#. So you can, mutate it as much as you want, create new types in your template, to do a lot of powerful processing. Another one we also looked at was Liquid, which is kind of between the two. It supports more than handlebars, but it's very Ruby based. And as a C# developer, it may feel kind of awkward to start piping strings through Ruby commands, and there's a learning curve to that. And so the reason we're choosing T4 initially is because of that history with EF6 and also the familiarity with C#. And just because we're adding T4 now doesn't mean we can't support other flavors later. Again, handlebars already exist today, so.
Good point. Okay, so we're at the end of the highly requested features section. If I didn't cover the feature that you were wishing was in there, go vote for it. Like I said before, that's the main way we decide what gets into these things. I actually want to jump forward to the clear path forward from EF6 now, because there's a lot of overlap of that with the highly requested features. So I think it's fairly obvious to at least people who are tuned in enough to be watching this stand-up that we are not developing EF6, the old stack, anymore. We are putting all of our efforts into EF Core. We're going to make that obvious and clear on the EF6 GitHub repo, make it very clear that, we're not developing this any further. That is very different from saying it's not supported. It is supported, and what supported means is that if there's a security bug, for example, found in EF6, then we would fix that security bug and ship it out. If there's a extremely critical bug, and what I mean is it's setting people's PCs on fire, that kind of bug, then we will probably also fix that. If it's just that this isn't working as expected, we're unlikely to fix it. Now, that's not just because we don't want to spend resources to fix it, although that is part of it. It's also because of the balance between stability and fixing things. Like whenever you do a bug fix in something, especially in something that's now quite old and doesn't have a whole lot of a lot of Bryce and myself and Andre and other people on the team have worked on EF6, so it's not like we don't have any knowledge of it, but it's fairly paged out. It's on disk now. It's like it's probably maybe even in tape backup. It's not in our main CPU cache anymore for sure, right? So whenever you make those changes, you risk breaking something else. And on EF6, we think it's very important to maintain the stability of the product. The way it works now will continue to be the way it works. If you have existing applications that are using EF6 and you're not going to change those applications, you're not adding new features, you're not doing anything, then keep using EF6. It'll continue to be supported. It will continue to be stable. It'll continue to work the way it does now. And it also runs on .NET Core, or as it's now known as .NET. So if you've got a .NET 6 application, it can use EF6, and that's fine. Now, the designer and things like that are less. You have to do some workarounds to get that kind of thing working. But then that again goes to, if you're doing new development. If you're actually adding features to your app, if you're working with the app, then we would recommend that you port from EF6 to EF Core. And so, as we have this porting guide that we already talked to, that Jeremy's already published, we'll, try and make that better. And then there's a lot of these issues that I've already talked about: object materialized event, TPC, for example, that were supported on EF6 and aren't yet supported on EF Core, and we're putting these into EF7 as well to make this path from EF6 to EF Core as good as it can be to get you there. Having said that, we're not doing any work on EF6. I'm now going to say we're going to do some work on EF6, and that's because there's this one thing. As most of you are probably aware, there was System Data SQL Client, which is the ADO.NET provider for SQL Server that shipped in .NET Framework. That is no longer being developed. It still is supported. It still will get security updates and security fixes, but it's not getting features. New features are going into Microsoft Data SQL Client, which is decoupled from the framework. It runs on full .NET Framework and on .NET Core, .NET 6. But it's shipped as a NuGet package, and it's getting development, it's getting new features, it's getting, things like that in there. Some of those new features are around security in Azure, like different ways of authenticating your application using access tokens, so on and so forth. So what this means is that if you've got an application using EF6 that's running in Azure or using an Azure database, you really want to use the best practices for authenticating against that, but you can't right now because it's using system data SQL client that doesn't have that new stuff in. So the one thing we're going to do for EF6 is make it possible to use Microsoft Data SQL Client with EF6. I say we're going to make it possible. Eric EJ also already has a community kind of prototype library that basically works out there. So if you wanna go look at that, you can probably do it right now. He has also sent me a message saying that he's happy to contribute the official support to that. So while I say we're going to make this work, Eric is probably the one who's actually going to make it work.
And we're not going to take the credit for it.
Yes. This may result in a new release of EF6, so there may be an EF6.5. It may not. It may just be, here's how you plug in a different provider that uses Microsoft Data SQL Client. That still remains to be seen. Again, it's very unlikely this is going to work in the designer because the designer is fairly hard-coded to these things. And so this will be again, I have an existing application. It's using EF6. I want to run it on Azure and do the proper things with it, access tokens and so forth. Let me use Microsoft Data SQL Client to do that. So that's the one thing we are doing for EF6. Any thoughts, questions on that? Nope. Okay. Theme. .NET platforms and ecosystems. So this is, like I said earlier, making all of .NET work great with data. When I say all of .NET, that's very broad. So we've kind of simplified it down to a list of things that we think are the most important. It's a fairly substantial list, but it's not got everything in it. So basically, .NET MAUI is important. ASP.NET Core is important. These are in, I believe, alphabetical order, so there's no ordering intended on here. I guess dot comes before A, and Azure Synapse is what's Azure Synapse, Jeremy? Come on, tell us quickly what Azure Synapse is.
Azure Synapse.
Synapse. I'm British. It's Synapse.
Yeah, so Azure,
British neuroscientist, so I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so Synapse is sort of a big data platform that aggregates different types of data sources and lets you do big data analytics and everything else, but it provides a SQL-like syntax to interface with it. We believe it's T-SQL compatible, so you should be able to automate applications and write with EF Core against them, but it hasn't been fully tested. Like, we haven't tried out the edge case scenario, so we want to see where those gaps are, and if it all fits together, we can promote that as an officially supported endpoint.
Good stuff. Blazor. So we've got pretty good support for Blazor Server. We're also looking at Blazor WebAssembly. In particular, there's a lot of interest in doing SQLite in WebAssembly. That Steve Sanderson demoed that on .NET Conf. If you haven't seen that, you should go watch it because it's like mind-blowing. It's like what you can do there. We've got conversations going on with the ASP.NET team, with Eric Sink, about how do we make that a smoother experience. Just because Steve Sanderson can do it doesn't mean that it's easy for everyone to do it. So we want to make that a smoother experience. And then Windows Forms and WPF, these are actually, I'm not going to talk about our internal numbers, but these are very important platforms that a lot of people are using. And EF Core actually fits very nicely as a data binding, as a way of data binding to these things. But there's, we want to make that better. So actually, let me skip down to that since we're talking about it. So So there's this item EF Core graphical user interfaces, and this means .NET MAUI, but also means WinForms and WPF. And what we need to do here is, like, if you're in Visual Studio, how do I connect my EF Core up to my WinForms, for example? We want to make that kind of a better end-to-end experience. EF Core is actually designed to work with WinForms and WPF data binding very well, but connecting the dots up is pretty difficult. Bryce, you have anything to say on that?
I don't think so.
Well, this is one of the things on Bryce's plate, so, you know.
Yeah, .NET Framework had a really rich experience for data binding in the IDE, and I mean, that's kind of our goals, is to make some of those work in more modern platforms if we can.
Exactly. Okay, so let me go back up to the top here. So one of the things that fits into making this this better is distributed transactions. So distributed transactions is something that is essentially supported by native OS components, specifically in .NET Framework. It's supported by the Windows Distributed Transaction Coordinator. So if you have existing applications and you want to port them to .NET Core, and they use the Windows DTC, you can't do that right now because that doesn't work on .NET Core. So what this issue is about is making sure that, or trying to make it so that if you've got a database application that uses distributed transactions on Windows, then you can port it to .NET Core and everything will work. There's a lot more that this could be. So for example, this could be cross-platform, so you can also run it on Linux. That's not in scope right now. We have ideas, you know, Shai's looked at various things there, other people have. But it's not on the plate net now. Our goal here is to be able to port existing applications that run on Framework and use DTC to run on .NET Core. What it also could be is things like WCF, using distributed transactions in WCF. That's not on the table either. Again, this is databases. Specifically, we're looking at being able to use databases that, such as SQL Server, with DTC on Windows but running in .NET Core. Shai?
Yep, you said it. You said it all. I suspect there might be a chance, for example, WCF ends up getting supported based on how much what it means and how much effort it is. But it's not. It's a non-goal of ours. Let's say for 7. The scope is really, the idea here is to unblock all these people, like the general theme that we just discussed with EF6. Unblock people who already have their applications, who are stuck on .NET Framework, because they need to use the the distributed transaction capability. These people need to be able to bring their applications over to newer .NET.
This is I'm waving my hands around a bit here because this is one of the things where there's quite a lot of unknowns. We're going into this, it's quite ambiguous. It's also quite complicated. There's C++ code in there, as well as calls into native code. How we deal with all of that, it's a growth opportunity for Shai, I like to say as a manager. But yeah,
that's what we say when there's a task that somebody doesn't want to do.
Yes,
we call it a growth opportunity.
But anyway, the goal is to be able to port your Windows Framework applications to run on Core. EF Core tooling. So when we created .NET Core and the first versions of EF Core, there was a certain set of kind of patterns, technologies, app models. And our tooling was kind of geared around that, in particular things like .NET Standard and stuff like that. Excuse me. Things have evolved, and we want to update the tooling experience to be easy to use with what's out there and modern now, including MAUI. Bryce, you have anything more specific on that?
Yeah, the primary motivation here is to see just how well we can make the tools work with MAUI, with for example, with iOS or Android projects. Early on in the first version of EF Core, we tried really hard to do this. EF6 used app domains. As you may know, app domains don't really exist in .NET Core, and so we ran into a lot of limitations. Since then, there's a thing called assembly load contexts. They've evolved a ton since we first tried to use them. And we feel like they're probably in a place where we can start using them again and enable more platforms. So we're just kind of going back to some work we tried to do early on in 1.0. It wasn't ready. now we think it's ready. So we're going to go back and try and make the tooling a much better experience.
Good stuff. I've already talked about the GUIs thing. Okay, SQL Server Core, Woodstar. So this is something that we started last year. The idea here is basically to create a modern, fast driver for SQL Server on .NET. We've talked about Microsoft Data SQL Client already. It's very old code base. It's got a lot of tight coupling between the features. It supports lots of things in SQL Server, and if you need that all of that support for all of those SQL Server features, and you need that compatibility with the way things have always worked, then that's still the thing for you. And it's still being invested in. There's a note about that here. What we really want to do with SQL Server Core, or codename Woodstar, is create something that is modern, but doesn't, and it's fast and performant, but doesn't necessarily support everything in SQL Server. Originally, we were kind of targeting Stack Overflow as being like, okay, can Stack Overflow run on Woodstar? That would be a good thing to say. Yeah, okay, we were a real thing can do that. We're probably going to actually look instead at some first party thing at Microsoft and try and get it to run on Woodstar, make it fast but not necessarily support everything. Smit on the team is gonna, we wanted this, we still want this to be community involvement. A lot of community involvement, a lot of interaction with the community on driving this forward. We want your ideas, your pull requests, and all that stuff. But we're actually putting a big chunk of Smit's time into this to really drive it forward and get somewhere on this. So that's Woodstar. Shai, you have anything to add on that?
I don't think so. I mean, the important thing is that we're going to be concentrating with the future in mind rather than implementing backwards looking things. So this would be a very very modern tech kind of oriented driver. I'm not sure it would support synchronous IO, for example, because the modern thing is to do async IO. I'm just giving that as an example. There's lots of features out there that SQL Server supports, which are considered very legacy by now. I think UDTs is maybe an example that we would not necessarily spend the time on implementing. This is a very forward-looking initiative.
Maybe Mars is a good example of that. Multiple active result sets. I think would be very unlikely to support Mars on Woodstar.
That's a very good question. I mean, we should discuss. I mean, it's obviously not something we have to do right away in any way, but Mars is an interesting thing. It's always a question of whether the problem with Mars is with the idea itself or with the current implementation that SQL Client has in it.
True.
Big discussion.
Anyway, yes. So let's definitely look out for more stuff on that. That's going to be interesting. Cosmos DB. Cosmos is getting significant growth in its adoption of use in EF Core. Lots of people have started using EF Core. We got to a place where a lot of people are pretty happy with the Cosmos provider in EF Core 6.0. A lot of people are saying also needs this, or as always, I absolutely can't run my application unless it supports feature X, Y, or Z. What we've done here is kind of distill a list of the things that we believe, based on votes and based on interactions with bigger customers and various support people and accounts and things like that. These are the things that people need. Voting is important again. So if your Cosmos feature isn't in this list, then vote on it, because that's how we will know, we will know that that's important to you and you need it in the Cosmos provider. Migrations experience. So we're always trying to improve migrations, the experience of it. We introduced migration bundles in 6.0, which has been very well received. A lot of people love it. Now, I will say, just because we're here, if you're using scripts and you know how to use scripts and you've got all the deployment stuff sorted out with scripts and you can run them in the right place and everything, that's fine. Like, we have people say, why should I switch from that to bundles? You don't have to. Doing that stuff is quite complicated for a lot of people. Bundles makes it a lot easier to get started and do something that's going to work well. So keep giving us your feedback on bundles, because we want to make those better where necessary. And then, for example, we want to be able to execute all migrations in a single transaction rather than a transaction per migration. Complications around, which is best and doing both of those things, but that's something that a lot of people ask for. And then we also, there's another big thing on migrations that we've talked about a lot, which is making it easier to get started with your database application without getting bogged down by migrations right away. So we had automatic migrations in EF6 that had a lot of issues. There was a lot of places where that could go wrong. It required certain data to be stored in the database that was not ideal, and there's various things why reasons we're not bringing that back. On the other hand, at the moment, when you do a new ASP.NET Core application and you're getting started, you get a page saying you need to apply your migrations to the database before you can get started. What we would like is to be able to, as you start developing, create that database automatically for you, migrate it at the point where you're like, all right, this is a proper application, I'm going to manage things properly, then switch over to doing, generated migrations in the normal way. Did I say that right, Bryce?
Yeah, that sounds right. There's the second half of this too, which is about coming from EF6 or even another existing database and starting to use migrations. Today you have to jump through a bunch of hoops like generate a migration, but comment out all this code, then execute it, then uncomment the code. It's a painful process, and we want to smooth that transition.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, there's a kind of subcategory here, which is modern.NET. Looking at it now, I'm not entirely sure why I made this subcategory, but there you go. So a big thing on this that Shai's already actually working on is trimming. When you look at things like Blazor applications, especially the WASM stuff that Steve Sanders was showing, you get a pretty big EF assembly that you have to use. We want to make it possible to both use applications in EF that have trimming enabled and have it work, and also trim stuff out of the EF core assembly that you're not using, so that you get a smaller assembly size, which in turn makes it easier to do ahead of time compilation and things like that. Shai?
Yep, that's pretty much it. This is something that's already in the pipe, and I hope I'm pretty sure we'll be able to deliver something that will allow you to turn on trimming safely, and at the same time, it would mean that your end assembly, your end application size is much smaller. Hopefully, that's the idea.
Okay, so Andrea on the team is working with the LDM, the language design team, to basically allow us to start re-evolving C# system link features. So you may know that newer features in C# are not supported when you're trying to write expressions. We're working with the Roslyn team there to implement a way that they can be supported without breaking everything that's out there already. And that's one of the primary problems and why things haven't evolved is, for example, if I've got EF6 running and it's trying to parse my expression trees, and then suddenly the compiler is generating a different expression tree, how does it deal with that? So there's various, there's a plan for this. I think that I'm not sure if it's out there on public or not, and I don't know exactly when this is going to go in, but we're definitely working with that. Andrea is working with that team to be able to move this forward. So like no coalescing, or I think I don't remember which one specifically. But there's a lot of the new operators that new, as in several years old now, that don't work in expression trees, and this would allow some of those to start working. Similar but different. New LINQ operators get added to the BCL. We've had some of these. What did we have in already, Shai? Remind me.
So there's max by, min by, stuff like that. Right. There's some stuff that may make sense in a database, and some stuff that absolutely doesn't make any sense in a database. There's distinct by, which maybe I will do at some point for Postgres, but doesn't have an equivalent for other databases. There's all the time all kinds of LINQ operators coming in, and we always have to evaluate how feasible, how much it makes sense to actually try to translate those. In many cases it doesn't. In some cases it does.
Yeah, so we want to be a little bit more on top of that if they're coming in .NET 7, then we want to look at them in the EF7 timeframe if we can, and say, okay, yeah, this is a simple translation. Let's just do it. Or, this is complicated, so maybe if enough people want it, we might do it. Or as Shai said, some cases it's like this doesn't translate to a database well at all. And that's actually, people say, well, all of LINQ translates to database. Well, that's not true. There's always been LINQ stuff that doesn't. A lot of the indexer methods, for example, where you get an index passed into your Lambda expression, none of those have ever translated in LINQ to SQL in EF or in EF Core. So there's a lot of cases where things don't have a natural translation. Where they do, we want to be able to, get the full power of LINQ and support those in EF Core. Open telemetry. Actually, I'm just going to let Shai talk directly about open telemetry.
Okay, so open telemetry, for people who don't know what it is, it's an observability set of standards for knowing what happens basically in your application. Observability is like this pompous word. Basically, it means it encompasses tracing, logging, and metrics. What it basically means is that your application is reporting information about what happens inside it. It's not just logging in the sense of text lines coming out, which you then have to look at, but something more structured, which has in many times a standard structure that really allow you to understand what's happening. Now, this specific thing is very dear to my heart. There is an evolving standard about how to report information, how database applications can report that they're accessing the database. So if your application is sending some sort of SQL to your database, that thing could be traced in a standard way that would be recognized by tools looking at it. Now, this is still a draft standard in the open telemetry thing. It's not related to .NET. This is like a global effort across languages, across frameworks, and so on. When this actually finalizes and works, then you would be able to fire up, some generic monitor product that looks at your EF Core application or non-EF Core application and can know and can tell that it's doing stuff on the database. The way OpenTelemetry also works is it even plots a hierarchy of things. So if, for example, you get a web request, and as part of this, you're executing 2 database requests, those are actually subordinated even graphically. So you can really see the web request took 500 milliseconds, and 250 milliseconds of that were in this database request and that database request, and so on and so forth. So this is about vastly improving how you can tell what's going on in your production applications, which are running and, making your websites work. We plan to work on pushing through this standard and making sure it's all that it can be in 7.0, and especially work together with other driver writers, in other platforms, Java, Python, and so on. This is not just a Microsoft .NET technology thing. It's more of a, cooperative thing between, different frameworks.
Good stuff. We also, this is another Shai thing, where we also like to keep making smaller improvements to system data. There's a batching API that went into 6.0. Shai is already working on some new kind of factory type pooling improvements to system data. So expect to see, some of that work coming forward. I don't think we need to go into the details yet. Still looking at it, but it's exciting to see. So this is actually, I've always been thought, well, don't use system data directly, because really you should just use Dapper or EF Core or something. But this is actually making system data actually better to use in of itself, which Shai has convinced me actually does make some sense. So this is one where Shai got his way rather than me, I think. We're going to do a bunch of research. This is mostly Jeremy and I, into how data access works in microservices, cloud native type applications across different platforms, whether that's Java or Go or whatever, and see what we can learn from that, and pull some of the findings we found into plans potentially to move forward with .NET data. So that's kind of just there for interest. And then we already talked about the clear path forward from EF6, so let's move on to performance. Like I said, performance is super important to us. There's two main areas here in performance. The first is general performance for database inserts and updates, and this is both EF and at lower levels. So Tech Empower has, well, let's talk about Tech Empower later, but so this is, we have the Tech Empower benchmarks, which are good for, okay, what's the absolute fastest you can do these things? But they're not necessarily very related to real world things that people actually do when they're using EF in their applications, using trains checking, using save changes, so on and so forth. So part of this work is let's make sure that when you're doing updates, inserts and updates, deletes in EF Core, that they are fast. We've spent a lot of time working on query perf. This is spend more time working on that side of the perf. So related to that, but not directly the same, is the Taking Power Composite Score, which involves both update performance as well as things like single query and fortunes. So we're really hoping to improve the performance on the Taking Power Composite Score. Obviously, the main goal here is the non-EF scenario. The fastest it absolutely can be if you use ADO.NET directly, and get as close to the metal as you can be. We also have EF7s in there. EF7 actually already does pretty well or EF6, EF Core 6 does pretty well in terms of its ratings against other ORMs in the benchmarks, and some of the other OMs I would be embarrassed to call them an ORM, but anyway, that's a different matter. But yeah, so we want to make this composite score better. We want to get better on those other benchmarks and kind of hopefully move up our performance and hopefully up the table. But that also depends what other people do in tech and power. You want to say anything more about perf, Shai?
I don't think so. We're a bit close for time, so I'll hold myself.
And then I've just listed a bunch of miscellaneous things here that you can scan down and look at these issues. Like I said at the beginning, there's a GitHub issue where you can go comment and discuss and ask questions, clarify things. Make sure you vote for issues on GitHub that you want. And if you want to know more about how we come up with these kinds of things, there's a document about how we actually do the planning and what we consider. And I think that's it. That's the plan for EF7. Do we have any questions holding over? Have you answered everything, Shai? And you've been typing away the whole time as you do. So
yes, I'm typing a lot. No, I think it's okay. I think we've answered most of the questions. Lots of interesting questions.
Okay, that's good. It's I'm glad I remembered all that after the holidays. So we're excited on the team to get into this. We've got some good community stand-ups planned for the coming weeks with lots of guests coming up as well. So look forward to that. And I guess we're probably over time, so we can pretty much end it there, unless anybody else has anything. No?
Nope.
Okay, so, and then also I've been learning a bit of music production, and Jeremy is a rapper. So we have an entity framework rap that we're just putting the finishing touches to. So I'm sure everybody will be really excited to see that. I'm going to put it on my SoundCloud. We'll tweet about it and stuff. Jeremy might make even an official music video for it. So if you want a little bit of fun and want to laugh at a couple of old white guys doing a rap, then look out for that. And with that, I think we'll say goodbye and join us in a couple of weeks for the next one of these.
Sounds good. See you, everyone.
Bye, all.
Bye.